The decision makers, however, attempt to manage these clouds of sociality according to input output matrices, following a logic which implies that their elements are commensurable and that the whole is determinable. They allocate our lives for the growth of power. In matters of social justice and of scientific truth alike, the legitimation of that power is based on its optimizing the system's performance, efficiency. The application of this criterion to all of our games necessary entails a certain level of terror, whether soft or hard, be operational, that is, commensurable, or disappear. Welcome to another edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, consider, typing www.patreon.com/MUHH in your browser and dropping us $1 a month for the show. Support us, etc. If not, maybe leave us an awesome review on iTunes. Either way, we appreciate y'all. Taylor and I are back in the saddle for another exciting discussion on Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. I'm curious what made you suggest this text? Aside
W
from its brevity, I guess.
Well, it is shorter than it sometimes seems. It's fairly dense. It's a nice little chunker. It's a little narrative instead of a grand narrative, my friend.
Petit narrative. What's narrative in French?
Récit. I mean, I'm not sure the word he uses, if he uses récit for narrative or, but yeah, I mean, récit is like a story, it's a narrative. Histoire is also a story. We'd have to look at the book because he says in the appendix, he says like little narrative. Maybe they provide the French, but yeah, I think it's Racine. In any case, this is one of those books I haven't read in 15, 20 years. It's one of those books that's kind of like you're expected to know the punchline, right? Of postmodernity is incredulity of towards meta narratives, towards grand narratives. It's sometimes he'll talk about meta narratives, and we'll have to distinguish this at some point. But he'll also talk about grand narratives. I think it's best if you want to be safe to talk about the grand meta narratives. And we'll talk about why he thinks science needs narrative, which he includes in the domain of knowledge, that there is a type of knowledge that would be narrative. Why science has to rely on narrative, whether it explicitly recognizes that or not, to legitimate its function as a discourse. That's the thing, right? It's like one of those theory 101 books, right? That's even if you don't read the book, it's like, okay, Leotard it provides at least two kind of provisional working definitions of postmodernism. One in the body of the text on the postmodern condition, right? That we read for today, and one in the appendix that became a part of this text that's after this text. And they're actually different if you think about they're actually two different domains. And I guess we're just jumping into it, but I mean, I'll be brief. In the postmodern condition, it's a kind of an epistemological question
Right.
about
Yeah, how does knowledge function in this new postmodern social
right.
system or set of relations?
Right. So, in the epistemological framework, in the body of the text, it's a question of incredulity towards grand meta narratives, that we no longer believe in these grand meta narratives of the life of the spirit and the speculative unfolding of knowledges as moments in absolute knowing in a Hegelian sense, or no longer believe in this discourse about the progress of the emancipatory subject, right? So there's a downfall, for example, of a kind of teleological, eschatological finality of time towards, let's say, the end of capitalism and the birth of through the revolution and whatnot. Not that I think that he doesn't necessarily think that combating capitalism is wrong or futile, although it may seem so. It's that this grand narrative we tell ourselves of a kind of utopian vision of a future after the downfall of capitalism is at the very least a bit simplistic and perhaps naive. So those are just two of the grand meta narratives. I think he lists like three or four in the intro. Those are two of the main ones that he'll center in on. So postmodernity being a kind of incredulity, a kind of a disbelief, a lack of belief in this is what he'll also elsewhere call decadence following Nietzsche. There's a decadence of the belief in the true and the belief in the unity, say, of like the nation state, the belief in finality, and even the belief in pedagogy in a certain extent. These meta narratives, to say the least, are held suspect. And in the little appendix, answering the question, what is postmodernism? He wants to make sort of modernism this move whereby the unpresentable is presented yet almost nostalgically as this like missing content, right? Because for him, it's all based on this aesthetic of the sublime, which is a discrepancy, a gap between what is conceivable and what is imaginable or sensible. The second way, the postmodern way, would be to present the unpresentable without this nostalgia, to endure the pain of conceiving what is unable to be sort of presentable through the imagination or sensibility. The example he gives, again, he's moving very quickly, but he gives this like an example of Joyce. If anyone's tried to read like Finnegan's Wake or something like that, for Lyotard, this is kind of like quintessential postmodern art. It presents the unpresentable through the writing itself, right? Through the signifier itself, which is why it can be painful to read, but at the same time, you get a kind of jouissance in like hunting down what Joyce is doing in that text. You almost get kind of like a high, like a runner's high, if that makes any sense. That's almost like the sublime. It's like a metaphor for the sublime, right? You get that run, you get those endorphins from like punishing your body,
Right, yeah.
So those are two quite distinct, but there are links between the two definitions of working definitions, I would say, of postmodernism. I mean, I think to be clear though, and I think to follow his language, postmodernity would be what we're talking about today, right? For this text. I think he says postmodernity is incredulity towards meta narratives. Postmodernism would seem to be more of this question of the aesthetic based on the sublime and not on, let's say, like the beautiful, which would be a kind of more modern take. I think that if I were to be, and I would have to double check, even check the French to make sure I'm right. I think to be clear, maybe he doesn't provide two definitions of postmodernism, but a definition of postmodernity and a definition of postmodernism. And we would need to distinguish between the two. One would be the aesthetic category that I just mentioned, and the other would be this question of an age of, let's say, whether it be the rules of language games or an epistemological age or whatever, brought about by the two world wars and the defeat of, what does he say, the post Keynesian like renewal of capitalism, blah blah blah. He's very sketchy on like the historical factors, but we can locate it after World War II, right? So at the time that he's writing this book, 1979, it's, I think that we're well within that era. And one of the big factors he points to, which may or may not be a part of the historical period, is the computerization, informatization of society, knowledge, the storage of knowledge and database, who owns the database, right? One of the last things he calls for in that last paragraph is kind of like, if we want to prevent the kind of terror that can come from computerizing society down to the finest details and rigidifying consensus as the norm, and thereby instituting a type of technological terror, the data bank should be open and free. You can imagine Leotard would be someone pretty keen on piracy, knowledge piracy, like book downloading from LibGen, ARG, Sci-Hub, these kinds of things, that paywalls. to information would probably be anathema to this call
Yeah.
for open access. That was just a general sketch, but I think that that provides a nice. I guess I only answered your question in a shitty way, but my main thing was that it's just a basic. It's like grad school theory 101 text, intro to theory class, happy hour. I thought we would revisit this to maybe talk a little bit about and see if we can I won't say deepen, but at least go into a little bit about maybe scratch the surface beyond this incredulity towards meta narratives, right? Whether in the Hegelian variant or the emancipatory, liberatory variant. His context was different, but in the introduction that in the preface that Frederick Jameson wrote for the English translation, he mentions Foucault's history of sexuality and this ambivalence. He calls it this passionate ambivalence towards the narrative of sexual liberation. And I think that there is something I would draw resonances between that wariness towards discourses about sexual liberation and whether or not that sort of like just lifts repression and everyone's free now, right? To sort of what Lyotard is trying to diagnose in the downfall of the grand meta narrative of, say, the revolutionary subject emancipating itself at the end of history or at the end of capitalism. And whether or not, in the end, I think his main concern is if the crisis of truth's ability or science's ability, as he puts it, to legitimate its own discourse doesn't have these reverberating effects with, say, the ability for prescriptive statements about the just and the good, the ethical, practical statements, that language game being able to ground itself on knowledge, thereby it becomes this kind of cascading effect, right? So I could have said that better, but I didn't want to like unpack all of that just yet. I want there to be a little bit of like opacity here for us to
Mhm.
unpack. But I'll take a breath and maybe let you answer your own question why you think, because you've read this before. And so I just wanted to maybe give your reactions to coming back to it again and justifying why we're talking about it, if I can reverse the question.
I mean, I think Leotard was incredibly prescient in this text. My appreciation and understanding of how that, like, I think when I first read it, I was sort of in agreement, but now I understand more intimately the why he or the how he was correct. I have a more sophisticated appreciation for the argumentation and what he's really driving towards in a way that I obviously just didn't have the context for when I read this in like 2000, whatever, like 5 or 6, 7, somewhere in there.
Yeah, that'd have probably been around the time when I read it as well. Maybe a little bit earlier, but could have been too much more. I agree with you. When I first read it, when I was first exposed to this, you're kind of like bombarded with the Norton anthology of theory and criticism. It's like, this 2,000-page Bible. And it's like, well, here, read a snippet from here or there. And I believe it would have included sections from this. I'd have to look at my volume, which was the second edition, which I'm not making fun of that book. I recommend it to
Mhm.
people. It's a great book for sources, for sort of slices. Whether or not you would call it a theory canon is perhaps too strong, but it does give you a kind of good sense of what, at least in the humanities, is cachet, right? I mean, because Leotard will talk about this. One of the aspects of the shift from modernity to postmodernity is how sort of knowledge as the discourse of the true becomes less and less about this use value, even if it still retains it to a certain extent, and more towards the side of an exchange commodity where information becomes saleable. And this dialectic he sees justifying why Marx thinks of science as directly implicated and participating in and as a force of production. This is towards the end of the book when he's talking about which research projects get funded if they can justify their ability to sort of produce affects their efficiency, their ability to increase productivity and blah blah blah. Right? Like if you are able to justify your research in the name of the technological language game, which he says doesn't operate like the scientific one, which is based on truth, or the practical one, which is based on justice, or the aesthetic one, which we brought up momentarily, based on the beautiful and sublime, but on this criteria of efficiency, optimization. That's the research that gets funded, and a little bit of the surplus value extracted from that is left over to research new projects in this way, like snowballing research as a kind of capital form of thought, as Laruelle has talked about before, but as a force of production in the extraction of surplus value. I wanted to knock that out real quick so we don't have to talk about that later, but we might bring it back up in the context of these various language games. But I'm glad you did enjoy this. And I will say, before we actually like start talking about it, because we have done Lyotard before. Well, two things. One, we had done Lyotard before. We have the series on libidinal economy, which what would have been written 5 years prior in 74.
Yeah.
So there's 5 years. Sometimes the era of the 70s, Lyotard has, and I want to find the interview where he says it. I've talked to some colleagues about this, but where he talks about it as this evil period where he makes retractions and things like this, right? I've translated a piece from that, which I've shared with you a long time ago. The piece, I just call it the decadence essay. It's got a weird title, this question of decadence and crisis, and the downfall of the values of truth, unity, finality, that kind of shit that I was talking about.
Mhm.
I think all of that does feed into this book, but libidinal economy is one of those texts where it's in a hazy state of disavowal, at least later in life. I guess I wanted to talk to you, or at least get your reaction about, now that you've revisited it, the difference in the tone, the mood, the clarity, the style of this work, which at least he indicates he wrote it sort of for for a Quebecois kind of committee as a literal quote unquote report on knowledge. So it's almost interesting that he's indicating a beforehand, he's writing it kind of for a state institute, just to contextualize a little
It's a
bit.
bit ironic, yes.
Yeah. What's your feelings about this Lyotard versus like the evil Lyotard of libidinal economy?
I mean, he still has some bangers. Obviously, the style is not so quite as acceleratory or inflammatory or relentlessly libidinally charged, but he's got some bangers. I mean, whenever he said that bit about God, there was one part where I literally was like, "Ah!" And I think it was the line about knowledge loses its what is it? Knowledge ceases to be an end in itself, it loses its use value. When I read that, I audibly was like, "Ah!" He's still a great writer, I think, and, he toned it down a bit for this. Could have been audience driven, I'm sure. But, I mean, we've also looked at we didn't record on it, but, I mean, I started reading what is
The
it? Not
different.
The Differend, which was
Yeah, we
a
started reading the
fucking
different.
that was the driest shit ever. Had a had a hard time with that one. This was good.
I still think the different is probably one of his most important books. So eventually we should return
Yeah.
to it.
I think I just need more exposure to Kant and, like,
We did do a little more Kant,
a little
right?
bit, but I still need, like
Still need you
I
need
still
you,
need more.
you need a critique of
We
pure
might have to do
reason
the
and
groundwork at some point, I
the
think.
groundwork, the
Yeah.
critique. I mean, doing the whole critique, man, that's like a year
Yeah,
and a
that
half
would be brutal,
project. But
but maybe we can get some of the best secondary lit or
yeah,
something,
well, we'll think about delving into
or,
more
like,
Kant.
figure out maybe there's chapters or I don't know.
I do think
Because,
that
yeah,
there
dude, Kant fucking sucks to read.
I mean, I do think that you don't need that much Kant to do the different, but I'll have to see. I'll have to think about how we could approach that text in the future and when we can put it off for a little bit. Ironically, in French, the word différer is to defer and to differ. So we'll literally it'll be a differend. It'll be deferred. In any case, I remember this text, and I didn't see it in this text, so Leotard must say it elsewhere. but I've said this to you, and so I should have been, or I would have been misremembering when thinking about this text, although I think it's related, is where, he does pose this question of imagine data banks, all the information that humanity has accumulated being stored in these data banks in satellites, which now we could say like the cloud. Like who owns the cloud? Which state has access to it or controls it? Or really, he says, would they not be just mere users in line to multinational corporations? And so, what I like about that question is that it reminds me of a question that really I think Marx brings up and formulates, but I'm going to formulate in my own way because I think that Lyotard himself has talked about this, where it's like, look, and this might be a part of post-modernity or whatever, but with the downfall of the nation state, or at least the crisis of the legitimacy of sovereignty, which is concomitant with this crisis of knowledge, it's like, well, capital doesn't really care about national borders, right? It doesn't care what form of currency it's in. So with the rise of multinational corporations and with this question of the computerization of society, informatics, the data banks being offshored, who owns the knowledge, blah blah blah, we could say the same thing where it's like information doesn't care which language it's in, which or it doesn't care about nation states either. It becomes this is why knowledge becomes more of an exchange commodity, very much like capital. So it doesn't give a shit about national borders, doesn't care about your ethno nationalism. So there is a sense in which there is a direct political correlation to what Lyotard is bringing in the focus with this question of capital information being multinational, or we could say in the same way, a national. It's indifferent to nationality. Doesn't matter if it's in euros or dollars or whatever. So that kind of shows, at least to a certain extent, how, in the same way that science brings about through its fidelity to its procedures of we could think of even beginning with Descartes, if not before, of radical doubt. It brings about its own crisis in questioning its foundations. Capital, too, this is why capital is always in crisis because it brings about, it not only sort of dissolves nation states, family, communities, the values that gave rise to it, but also has to, re-elaborate new ones and throw those into crisis, right? So it's perpetually undermining an essential element of what made it possible. And I think that's the same for science. And I think that this is why Lyotard later turns to sort of Nietzsche and this question of European nihilism to chart this development. But we could take a step back and maybe start with follow a little bit of the line of Lyotard's arguments before we jump around. I know a lot of times we like to just jump around, and that's fun, but we could talk a little bit, set some of these things out more clearly. We don't have to even define too many terms before going into the weeds. I mean, one of the things that I brought up was how, for Lyotard, let's talk about a few distinctions. So one of the things that Lyotard wants to say is we can at least talk about these language games, which is a phrase that he inherits from Wittgenstein. To each discourse, there would be a type of language game, right?
Mhm.
Where there would be, we could start with the language game of science, since this is a report on knowledge. And to a certain extent, one of the key aspects of the language game of science would be based on the order of what Lyotard calls the denotative, which is just a typical kind of linguistic form of what we might think of basically as the declarative sentence, right? The earth revolves around the sun, which would be a kind of Copernican denotative statement, which at the time was highly politically charged, right? So denotatives can be full of intensity. They're not as boring as they may seem to be,
Mhm.
right? Because that was a new, what Lyotard would call a new move in the language game of science, dominated by an Aristotelian Ptolemaic view of, and Catholic. because it's an ideological view of the universe and man's place within it. And even though Copernicus wasn't the first to make this move, we have what is it, Aristarchus of the Greeks, who already had kind of measured the diameter of the Earth and already put forward. And there's is it Eratosthenes? My Greek history is a little. There's at least like two or three famous Greeks who put forward a heliocentric theory. But at the time that Copernicus is stating this in the 16th century, right? It's those would have been rare, if not repressed or forgotten moves. In any case, so if science is the discourse of the true, its way of its mode of argumentation is based on the putting forth of denotatives, right? These denotative statements. The earth revolves around the sun, water is composed of, you know, or, ether is not a viable substance, whatever, and really for Lyotard, the rules of the game, are bound by a kind of consensus of a community of scientists. It involves a kind of didactics and a pedagogy, right? Because you make new scientists by making new players, by transmitting the form of argumentation, which is based on observability, verification, experimental repeatability, all the stuff that we kind of fall under the heading of the scientific method and things like that, right? I'll go into consensus in a minute, but those aren't the only language games that Lyotard brings up. There's also the prescriptive language game, right, where the prescription presupposes the authority of the speaker, right? So we can imagine categorical imperatives as functioning under this ethical, practical, prescriptive mode. And what's fascinating about the categorical imperative is that for Kant, insofar as ideally rational subjects, insofar as we are all legislators and legislating this imperative, this prescriptive, because we are rational as legislators, we are also those we're legislating for ourselves, right? So we take on the categorical imperative, we sort of prescribe ourselves. But normally, prescriptives in the general sense, you have a speaker and an addressee. We can give commands, as we've seen with Deleuze and Guattari and Wittgenstein, even in the philosophical investigations. The order word is like the basis of how language works, right? It works by giving orders. But in any case, in this example, prescriptions for Lyotard, as he generalizes, would not necessarily be on the order of science because prescriptions are kind of like what should be done rather than what the discourse of what is, the discourse of ontology, or even what is possible versus what is ethical, practical, pragmatic, what should be done, not necessarily what can I know. As Kant lays out the three questions, right? What can I know? What ought I to do? What should I do? And what can I hope for? Those are all language games to a certain extent. The three critiques, if you want to like say that. But then there's also the performative, which we've talked about a little bit. This is taken up from Austin's How to Do Things with Words. And what's interesting about the performative is it's in the very act of saying that the activity is carried out, right? The judge says you're guilty. If he said that in the bedroom with a prostitute, that would be its own language game. But if he says that in the courtroom under conditions with a jury and a prosecutor and yada, 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 and the whole apparatus of law, that takes on the activity of the language game of performative. What's interesting about the performative is that its efficiency is what constitutes the authority of the speaker rather than the other way around. I think this is an interesting way that Lyotard puts it, right? It's like in the prescriptive presupposes the authority of the speaker. The speaker has authority to give commands, right? The master, the boss, president, whatever. But it's in the performative. It's actually the performative that and its ability to function in a given context, as I mentioned, like a juridical context, or like a priest at a wedding saying, I now pronounce you man and wife, blah, blah, blah. For Lyotard, it's the efficiency, it's the performance's ability to create reality that constitutes the authority of the speaker, not the other way around, as in the prescriptive. I only brought those up because those are sort of three of the examples, but I really liked the way that he did that, especially distinguishing the performative and the prescriptive based on the authority of language of the speaker and where, if that is presupposed in the speaker's status or if instead the status is conferred by the language game and the rules of the language game itself. I thought that that was an interesting thing. Now, sadly, we won't hear too much more about performatives throughout the rest of the text, but those are kind of like three examples he gives of language games. Later, we'll hear about the technological language game, the language game of efficiency and optimization, which I mentioned briefly earlier. So we can already consider there four. He mentions the questioning language game, which he says at the end of the book, this is something I think with the incredulity towards meta narratives implied in postmodernity for Lyotard, part of education, part of learning, part of future education, and part of the impetus in science to be wary of sort of consolidating around a type of consistency that would preclude future inventions is to cultivate new forms of the language game of interrogation, of self-interrogation. And by self, I don't mean necessarily our individual ideologies, but the, the whole discourses interrogation. So new, ever vigilant, like language games of questioning, I think two would be a kind of, I don't know if you I would say it's an ethical prescription on Leotard's part, but it's a suggestion at the very least. So those are like at least five language games that I just brought up, but there's others like he mentions the evaluative, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll pause there just so we can maybe talk a little bit about that and make sure that what I said was clear, at least if not ordered.
So I don't have too much to add there, to be honest.
And I mentioned terror earlier, and again, I am kind of doing a diachronic thing, but when Leotard brings up terror at the end, and of course he's one could think of a big terror, like whether it be the French Revolution and the aftermath of that. One could think of Stalinism, which is an aside example he gives, because he will relate terror to a type of totalitarian regime. But if we imagine language games as having players with moves, for example, in the denotative language game of science, scientists can make new moves that may that the only criterion of which is to provide proof and argumentation, which is a multi-layered thing. We'll get to the other layers soon. But the main thing would be you play the game by providing proof. For Leotard, language games are always amongst players and are always agonistic, right? Because whether or not we consider those enemies, there are always counter moves in the that are implied.
I mean,
And
I
yeah,
think it's due to absolute contingency means that since all needs or wants can't be met or all outcomes can't be reached, that necessitates by definition we have conflict.
right. This is what he calls agonistics,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
That this is one of the reasons we can start laying out a bunch of them. This is one of the reasons why Habermas is one of the main targets in this book, right? Because for Habermas, there's almost this Platonic Socratic ideal of a society of individuals in which consensus is reached through discussion that is kind of clear and transparent and avoids rhetoric, seduction, persuasion, quote unquote, in the sophistic sense. This is why Leotard, just to anticipate again, throwing all of these things out there on the wall
Mhm.
just to show our trajectories. This is why Leotard will kind of posit that it's actually consensus that is the death knell of the inventiveness of discourses, and here specifically science as a
Right.
language game. And so he will call for the cultivation of dissensus or dissension. In
It's
any
almost like
case,
the
yeah,
problematic is kinda has some resonance there, right? Because it's the problems that we encounter that
yes,
spur us to think or
Right.
It's the conflict between our wants and needs and another group or person or etcetera, or I may not want the sun to come up tomorrow, but there's gonna be a you know what I mean? I'm kinda stuck, if that makes sense,
Well, it's always
right?
possible that today's
It's
the day,
possible, right? But
but
things would have to be
improbable,
the pr
improbable.
the right conditions of the totality of possibility would have to be met for that to be a possible.
So I was mentioning terror. So terror would consist in, and I've kind of already outlined it, but would consist in this imposition of a type of consensus whereby speakers, movers in the game, players in the game would be excluded based on their ascension. Either you agree to the consensus, the state of knowledge, for example, or because there's two ways to invent for Lyotard. You either make a new move, right? A new statement. For
Mhm,
example, the earth revolves around the sun. Even if that was the resurrection of an old move, it was a novel move, let's say, for Copernicus. Or you can change the rules of the game. You can modify the rules of the game. And whether or not, depending on the statement, depending on the move, it may be harder to make a new move in the game. For example, Copernicus threatened with not only excommunication but execution by the church. Or it may be in general harder to change the rules of the game and still find players for the game, right? So, but in any case, those are two ways of invention in different modes of language games. But one of the examples I was thinking of, and I did some sleuthing, is Zimmelweis. You may recall my favorite movie is 12 Monkeys. I've told you about this. Brad Pitt has that great he has a couple of great monologues, but he has that monologue when he first meets up with Bruce Willis in the movie, and he's talking about Zimmelweis and these tiny little germs that are infecting everyone, right? And how he was considered crazy. And in fact, he was thrown into he had a breakdown and was thrown into an institution because he was mocked and excluded by the community and disregarded and misunderstood and all of these things. It has been argued that he could have done a better job not poking the bear, so to speak, not like talking shit about the medical establishment and these other things, and could have presented his ideas more clearly, yada, yada, sure. But in any case, his ideas were met with great resistance and misunderstood, right? Because it was misunderstood that he was merely claiming that diseases were communicable, as though that were that novel of an idea. But his idea of washing hands specifically with a kind of like, I forget what it was called. It was some kind of like chlorine compound, was met with resistance. So he was excluded from the language game. And in fact, there's something called the Zimmelweis reflex, which I'd never heard of. I learned something today. Named after him, obviously, where you have a knee jerk reaction, or the community or the language game, let's say, or the whatever, the discursive community has a knee jerk reaction, or it could be an individual reaction to considering the possibility of let's say, a new move in the language game, a new hypothesis or theory or whatever. You have a knee jerk reaction based on the state of opinion, which is what Lyotard will reduce consensus to, going back to one of philosophy's first enemies. Let's just call it orthodoxy. There's a knee jerk reaction against unconventional, unprecedented statements, hypotheses, theories based on the current state of knowledge, the consensus, the opinion, the orthodox view of things. I thought that was kind of an interesting idea of a Zimmelweis reflex, where, and I suppose that would be a good weapon in any conspiracy theorist's arsenal. It's like, well, you're just having a Zimmelweis reflex. So I think that that's the irony of, in my opinion, Lyotard's, and I'm going to go back to Habermas for a second, barrage against Habermas, because it's intermittent, but it's pretty brutal throughout the text. I mean, he could have been more polemical if he were Baudrillard or something. He could have been a little bit nastier. He's not really no ad hominem, sadly, but that's okay. If Habermas is ideally painting this picture in which consensus can be reached through clear and concise, friendly discussion with open and transparent rules, no persuasion, no seduction, no sophistry. It's ironic that Lyotard turns the tables on him and shows that actually reduces down to doxa, to opinion. If we go back to Plato and Socrates, if the main enemy of philosophy is sophistics and sophistry, making the weak argument the strong argument, blah blah blah, not wagering on truth like philosophy does, opinion is no less so an enemy. Doxa is no less an enemy of philosophy. And Deleuze and Guattari are really good about this in What is Philosophy, where it's like, look, all we want is a little bit of respite from chaos in order to lay out the planes of eminence, right? Lay out these planes of composition, for art, science, philosophy. And this is why opinion is so seductive, right? Because it can allow us to fall back on a safe, I was going to say a safe space, but that seems parodic, a little comfort, a little respite, a little refuge from the chaos. And that's why it's so insidious, because it allows us to rest on our laurels or something like that, right? It allows us to believe we have some kind of solid foundation and thereby begin to not question it. We begin to regenify a kind of consensus wherein you're only allowed into the language game if you abide by the fundamental rule of accepting this foundation as principle. That is a part, that's just an example, I think, of what Lyotard means by terror. This means of excluding players, to demanding their assent to one or several, one or even all, but at least one or several rules isn't, moves, predetermined moves, predetermined structures. I don't know the word for it. He's, you either agree or you're excluded. At the limit, it's your consent or your life, to like think of the Hegelian master slave narrative, right? Your freedom or your life. It's something similar is going on here, I think. And what Lyotard will say is that terror is to be avoided in this kind of theory of language games. Well, I mean, not just for the reasons that I, laid out, that terror by itself, we could say is bad, I suppose, unless you're the terrorist, right? But I think for him, language games, even the questioning of language games, right? Even the questioning of the legitimacy of a certain language game. Language games for him are like at bottom one of the fundamental weaves of the social fabric, of the social relation, right? And terror would be that which fundamentally cuts and severs the social bond. So it would put an end to the flourishing of the heterogeneity of language games. And I think in that sense, it would conflict with whatever we want to deem as progress or invention or creativity. It would try to regularize and standardize language games to an extent to which there would be an ultimate language game to an extent, which we sometimes find in the technological language game, as he puts it, because it would then reduce everything to power. And for Lyotard, I think there's a heterogeneity, a multiplicity of language games that can't be hierarchized or unified in one single language game, like might have been the dream of a classical metaphysics or something like this, as the queen of the sciences, or the speculative meta narrative, right, of the sciences as moments in absolute knowing, blah blah blah, right? There would be this hierarchy introduced and a kind of closing off of the system, which again, I think Lyotard would kind of say terror. I'm just extrapolating a little bit, but it seems to be pretty clear that terror would be a way of totalizing, because it is totalitarian for him, but it'd be a way of totalizing a system of language games, hierarchizing them, excluding moves, excluding players, excluding creativity and invention, and thereby sort of instituting and reinstituting a grand meta narrative. the imposing a meta narrative, which would itself be contradictory. For example, we can think of, I think that when Lyotard talks about Stalinism, he's thinking about how Stalinism comes into this era of being a reinforcing catalyst of the emancipatory meta narrative of the revolutionary subject. It's ironic that it uses terror as its means to achieve the end of revolutionary freedom. And I think that why that's another reason why, outside of just the ethical implications, but if we want to call it like an ethics of language games, then we could say that's why terror is bad in this context. Repost.
I don't have much to add as far as terror is concerned, I suppose. My questions would be more directed towards, like, the very beginning of the book. My first question, he makes this definition of the postmodern, and then he follows it up with this very interesting quote that I couldn't quite grasp or fully, but it sounds very interesting, and I think it may go towards the aspect of science you mentioned earlier, where it kind of negates it sort of negates its own authority in a way by working in this sort of negative through negation of its own quote unquote truths. And I'll read just the quotes so you can get context here. Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta narratives. This incredulity is undoubtedly a product of progress in the sciences, but that progress in turn presupposes it.
Right. So this is similar to what we discussed. Gosh, it's been a few weeks. We discussed this just as an example, an analogy. We discussed this in Nietzsche talking about the death of God, and it's the very desire for truth in Christianity and the concomitant philosophies that come in its wake, to desire for truth, that it ends up putting the lie to God. So, in the same way, and again, Descartes' just a prime example. He's an easy one, and Lyotard does call on him a couple of times in the class. Incredulity, doubt, methodological doubt, we could even say, is a product of the progress in the sciences, right? We could say that, for Descartes, it's not the language of truth per se, at least unless we think about it, truth is adequation, which we can, but it's certainty that Descartes wants to nail down. It's through methodological doubt, doubting everything, that I can come to realize in the activity of doubting, I am thinking. In the activity of thinking, I am. Rouillet says you could just as well have said, I am cooking, therefore I am, right? Because I am working towards a goal. But in any case, it's in
But there
this
is
move.
nothing outside the text.
Right. I mean, so in this movement, I am nailing down certainty, and I'm finding this certainty in the fact that God is not a deceiver. So there is a transcendent sort of anchor for this movement. But Leotard transfers this to nature, wherein, like, later he'll talk in the book, he'll talk about, one of the questions of science is if the other player in the game is nature, right? And nature's not necessarily loading the dice, right? It's not like say a human in the human sciences, at least the natural sciences with nature. Although obviously quantum mechanics and microphysics throws some unpredictability, undecidability into the mix. That's a part of nature itself, and not necessarily a way of deceiving and cheating. So in any case, so incredulity, methodological doubt, is a part of this progress in the sciences and their ability to legitimate itself and find a primal foundation. And so I think for him, it's just that it takes science a certain amount of progress to reach the point where it can find a way, whether it succeeds or not, just the fact that it has this thought experiment where it can eliminate or find ways of eliminating or criticizing itself and its pseudoscientific accompaniments, right? So, but that doubt itself promotes progress in the sciences, right? So it takes a certain amount of science. A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? As Alexander Pope said. So it takes a lot more to get to the point where we're doubting science's foundations, its legitimacy. But that doubt itself, even at the price of crisis of the foundation of the sciences, can spur progress along. And I think this is why Lyotard is calling for a renewed discourse or a renewed language game of interrogation where we become wary of not necessarily just the meta narratives, which are at the beginning of the text, but at what he calls like these meta prescriptives later at the very end of the text, which, Leotard has said this in different ways, like where science is not the scientists in science, or at least like the veritable scientists for him, aren't necessarily asking like what's the value of my research, which can always be put to capitalist consumption ends or ethical ends of, feeding millions of people, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it can always take these different forms, but also like, what is it exactly that we do as scientists? There is this question of radical doubt, not just being a product of progress in the sciences, but promoting the progress in the sciences, because radical doubt would at least provisionally have allowed for the scientific community, untethered by, say, the Catholic Church in its political and humanistic vision of man as the center of the universe, blah blah blah. It would have maybe allowed Copernicus more free reign to promulgate his ideas. It would have perhaps garnered Semmelweis a little bit more. I'm not saying trust, but his ideas could have been said, okay, let's test and verify rather than dismiss out of hand, right? So ironically, I think the Semmelweis reflex is like that at certain states of knowledge, doubt is not administered to oneself or to one's own presuppositions. So that's where
Is
I
that like
think
who proves the proof, or how do you prove a proof?
you're anticipating, and I like this.
I mean, I also think that this is where perhaps the fundamental difference between Hegel and Deleuze would be is that I think Deleuze, if I'm understanding correctly, would believe in sort of a positive knowledge versus the negation of Hegel, the undermining, the negation of like science contains its own negation within itself, or democracy contains its own negation within itself, right? How does a thing become its opposite? Or
With Deleuze, it's all very tricky, right? Because positive knowledge can mean a million things at the very least, because it can be conflated with positivist knowledge, which would be, a kind of
well, maybe
s-
a positive methodology, not positivism, but
right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting on those questions, which we'd have to revisit, where the movement of knowledge for Deleuze would be secondary to the positive movement of learning and what that entails and how that's linked to problematics, like you
yeah.
you mentioned. It's less propositionally dialectic in the basic sense
Mhm.
and less secure in this movement of moments in the spiral of negations leading to absolute knowing. That's a question for getting more Deleuzians and Hegelians on the show to discuss. But you did anticipate something really good where science needs science. Okay, this reminds me of, since you brought up Deleuze, this reminds me of what Deleuze says in the Logic of Sense that I think also applies to things like Bertrand Russell's, classes of whereby, there is no set of all sets, because the set can't belong, it can't be a member of its own set, where the sense of a proposition cannot state its own sense. A proposition cannot state its own sense. You need another proposition to state the sense of the first proposition ad infinitum. And Deleuze follows this through like Lewis Carroll's works and shows it very brilliantly. But the only thing that for Deleuze that can say its own sense is nonsense. And so I think that for Lyotard, we can see the same thing when the language game of science, the discourse of science, broadly speaking, even in the totality of all the statements, it needs another language game in order to legitimate its operation of, you know, proof by argumentation, proof by evidence, proof by observability, repeatability, whatever, the scientific method, quote unquote, right? This is why you said, what is the value of your proof is another language game than the scientific one. And even to the point where Leotard, can turn this around, and he does this at the end of the text where he's saying, this could go on, I suppose ad infinitum, but he at least says just as valid as this question of what is the proof of what is your proof worth? What is the worth of your questioning of what is the worth of your proof worth? Blah blah blah. So the incredulity towards Zimmelweis, the Zimmelweis reflex to this, which to be fair, Zimmelweis, it took till Lister, what, 20, 30 years later, to kind of experimentally and theoretically give more proof and rigor to what Zimmelweis was putting forth about washing hands to prevent childhood births. But what is the resistance to this new move in a language game worth? What is your resistance worth? Which might be something that, like, our interest in psychoanalysis, that might perk your ears up, right? With Freud, what is your negation, your no worth when you say no? Well, I know you're thinking it's my mother, but it's not my mother. What is that negation worth in the Freudian sense? We can imagine. And this is what Jameson wants to try to do with his little intro to this book, where he's like, well, the maybe the downfall of the grand meta narratives is actually they're going subterranean into the unconscious, and it's really the political conscious. By the way, I have a book called that. It's like, come on, man. Like, all right, fair, whatever. You know, I remember when I first read Jameson's intro to this book, I was taken by it, but rereading it for our discussion, I was like, man, you got some points, but you're rambling. I mean, like, I'm the only one allowed to ramble. I mean, I don't know about you. Anyway, so science needs another discourse to um to ground its legitimacy. I mean, you can think of, for example, like, I mean, this is why Kant, I mentioned it before, says the metaphysics is the queen of the sciences. This is a grand meta narrative. This is a philosophical pretension. Heidegger wants to say that the regional sciences need a fundamental science, let's call it ontology, to give it a foundation, in the questioning of being, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
Again, another philosophical pretension, a way of unifying or founding language games in a single discourse, here philosophy. And I think this is where Lyotard and Laruelle could be in great dialogue about what non-philosophy is trying to point out about what philosophy is doing. One of its moves, one of its primary moves, but one of its moves is this war amongst philosophers of, like, who will lead the sciences into the promised land of a unified discourse, right? And in that sense, it's Laruelle is fighting terror and totalitarianism to a certain extent on philosophical grounds, or against the philosophical. So this is why Lyotard will distinguish between, or at least admit that narrative is a form of knowledge. And he'll distinguish two kinds of knowledge. French has two words for knowledge. It becomes very, very frustrating to try to translate these words. German has two words for knowledge too that Kant uses. And so there's a similarity there. In English, it's a little bit strange. So in French, you got savoir, you got connaissance. In this book, and it doesn't show up too much, but they translate connaissance roughly as learning. And I think that that's generally not a good translation, except when you have to immediately juxtapose it with savoir, and savoir they just translate strictly as knowledge, and that's the word in the title of this book, right? The Postmodern Condition, a report on savoir, right? Savoir, if learning, if connaissance learning is this, is roughly reduced to the acceptance, let's say, and transmission of denotative statements, like the earth revolves around the sun, that is accepted as a denotative scientific statement. It more or less accords with the reality of the referent, with the state of affairs of things. Savoir would be something different, and we have in English. Lyotard gives a few of these, but the one in English that we at least have is savoir faire, which is like know how. Because savoir can be, in its phrasing in French, can be know how to infinitive, do something. So savoir faire, know how to know to do, if you want to just like reduce it. So savoir faire is it, and even in Greek, and I'm trying to remember the word for it in Greek, but even Socrates will distinguish opinion from knowledge, where opinion at best can attain the state of savoir faire, right? Because he goes to all these different people at their jobs, like the shipbuilder, and ask about the essence of shipbuilding. And, he goes to the priest and asks about the essence of piety, blah, 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 right? Like all of these people he's interrogating, these tradespersons, they have a know-how, but do they really know insofar as they can't transmit they can't play the language game in which they can reach the essence of the form of the thing itself, which is why Socrates is so fucking, like, I think Nietzsche like calls him like a gadfly, right? He's just like, he's constantly just berating these people about what they're supposed to be experts in. So there's this difference even in Platonic dialogues of like expertise, know-how, and true knowledge in the sense of transmissibility. Here, I think the revolves are a little bit reversed, because I think that if connaissance is that transmissibility of denotative statements and learning, which we can acquire by reading Wikipedia or Googling or something like this, which, if you saw at the end, when Lyotard talks about, how computerization of society and the access to data banks and the training and learning of manipulating interrogative discourses to ask the right questions to search the data banks. And he says that that's become human nature. We can think about how the means to acquire knowledge is like second nature, is like Googling now, right? But in any case, know how, he also says, know how, was it no hear or no listen, and no speak? There's a know how, there's a no speak, and a no listen. We have a know-how when we become competent speakers and listeners in a language game. We're able to function and play in the language game as senders and addressees of moves in the language game. Does that make sense? And so I think that we should distinguish between connaissance as mere learning and sort of the reception and transmission of the communication of messages and information versus competence. That's kind of what savoir gets reduced to, if we want to reduce these different forms of savoir to competence, at least on behalf of the players, because I think knowledge in general, savoir in general, is also its own thing. But in terms of the players and following the rules of the game, making moves in the game, and even maybe reinstituting rules and reshuffling them, that comes down to a certain competence, because it becomes this question of making good moves, which he always or usually puts in scare quotes. It's this question of making good moves that becomes a question of participating in certain games, because not every game is about winning. Not every language game is about winning, as Lyotard says. It's not always about beating your opponent, because there are some games wherein the moves themselves generate a certain delight, a certain pleasure, a certain fun. He gives a couple examples of this, art being one of them, but also the way that friends interact. which is never in one and the same language game. It's always kind of like shifting and cycling through various language games that in many cases have nothing to do with winning an argument, for example, making a good move in the sense of a debate club, but in the sense in which there is a jouissance in the very movement, the trajectory of cycling through language games and even playing on the rules themselves. I mean, like your use of of bad puns, right? Or my use of dad
Bad
jokes. It's
puns?
like bad puns, yeah. Bad puns are never punished.
Not enough, at least.
Oh, not enough, yeah. But in any case, I think for him, he says something interesting, and this is to finish that line of thought. One doesn't necessarily play to win, but also to invent, and to invent implies at least one adversary. And he mentions conventional accepted language, which he also calls connotation. But I think that a conventional accepted language, we could think of poetics could be a kind of, in the broad sense, could be a kind of language game wherein there is I mean, we kind of got into some of this with the distinction between the semiotic and the signifying, but we can think again, like this could also be applied to the state of convention itself, the state of opinion itself, wherein it is the consolidated opinion itself, consensus itself, that becomes the adversary and the obstacle for invention and creativity. So I think that even if narrative as a type of knowledge can accommodate science in its form of language game, science itself can't do it can't go the other way around. Science itself has a duty, as we mentioned with the Cartesian move of mythological doubt, blah blah blah, to hold narrative suspect. So there is a kind of interesting dissymmetry between science's need for a narrative of what we are doing when we do science to legitimate itself, to legitimate knowledge. And at the same time, you can think about like the validity of anecdotal evidence, whether it be in juridical inquiry or scientific inquiry, and how it is held suspect and how it cannot pass the test of being knowledge without some sort of interrogation. So this is the kind of paradox that Lyotard kind of calls for at the end of the book when he calls for little narratives that are local situations, not these grand meta narratives that are universalist in appeal. One can think of one persisting grand meta narrative in science itself, which would be like the grand unified theory of one equation to explain all equations, right? To explain the universe. That to me has always seemed like a kind of, obviously, like a grand meta narrative. It's in the fucking name, grand unified theory.
I was thinking about that after we had that discussion. Was it Sayre or the what did we read after? Oh,
Re-
it was Rouillet. So
yeah.
I can't remember if it was Rouillet or Sayre that was like saying you can't start at the top and work your way to the bottom, and you can't start at the bottom and work your way to the top, which is similar to this like disjunction between quantum physics and general relativity. You can start at the very infinitesimally small and try to build your system that way to the cosmos, and won't it won't work, or vice versa, right?
Yeah, I think that sounds like Sayre. That sounds a lot like Sayre. Although Rouillet could have said something similar because he was also aware, obviously, of
I
quantum
mean,
mechanics.
this was my jump off from not exact I forget the terminology from what they said, so we can table that, I suppose.
I do think that that's, as the list says, you always start in the middle, right? You start in the milieu.
Right. Yeah,
Your
good point.
everything grows from the middle like
Yeah.
grass.
Yeah, because 'cause we're always situated within a state of affairs, within history, within motion, which Leotard says here in the book.
Yeah, I mean, there is this disjunction between narrative knowledge and scientific knowledge, scientific language game and the narrative language game. And this leads to paradox. But instead of trying to resolve it and to erase it and to believe that there is a kind of Munchausen self bootstrapping of science by itself, Lyotard calls to kind of like sit with the paradox, to sit with it and to accept little narratives rather than hubristically calling for these resurrection of grand meta narratives, like in a grand unified theory. Although I'm not sure how prevalent that would have been during Lyotard's time, but it fits very well in this text. I think with this text, I think that's also why Lyotard calls for dissension rather than consensus. In his view of language games are always agonistic. As I said, you don't have to play to always win, but the way that he's thinking about these things, it is adversarial. The adversary, I mean, with when we talked about the mode of cycling through language games with friends, the adversary could be boredom or indifference or that which would threaten the intensification and endurance of the social bond between friends, which could be conventional language, but could also be a play on conventional language, right? Conventional language could be an accessory to the puns, right? And stuff like that. But in any
Mhm.
case, like,
Oh, right,
uh,
yeah, because like you were saying, there's gotta be this other language game. The regular language game is what makes possible the puns in a sense, right?
right, the conventional language, it would be kind of it would kind of be the butt of the joke, but also the means by which the joke has
Right, yeah,
has flourished.
exactly. And so, again, it undermines itself, right? Like, its negation is within itself, within its
Yeah,
process.
yeah. I mean, and so for Leotard, language games are always agonistic, but they're also the minimum required for society to exist. It's the minimum social bond, so to speak. And I think that this is one of the things where there is a kind of ethics of language games deep down in Leotard's idea of promoting dissensus through agonistics, and there's almost this like weird nostalgic fantasy whereby there would have been a unifying language game in the past that a community could have coalesced around to unify the values of truth, national solidity, a pre-given finality, all of these things that could be rationally reached through discussion and consensus. And I think Leotard thinks that that's just a kind of that's the nostalgia for a bygone era that actually never existed. And it implies at the end of the day, if that is the goal to attain and the means to reach it are any and all, then terror is the best and most efficient way to reach that destination. I think that Leotard is this is why he thinks the census is not a bad thing, not a negative. There is a kind of affirmation of a kind of discordance
Yeah.
of it's what Deleuze talks about with the discordant accord of the faculties or something like this, right? There's necessarily a kind of violence to thinking, and in the Leotardian sense, it might be the violence to thinking might be done in the advent of new moves in a language game or the rearrangement of the rules in a language game. That might seem like a violence to the conventional mode of thinking within that language game, right? That might seem like a violence to the players. And I think that Leotard is kind of calling for us to be wary of our comfortability in a certain congealed formation of discourse that might make us have this knee-jerk Semmelweis reflex, right, to a new move that is reactionary at the very least, I think, for Lyotard. So this is why he like attacks information theory or cybernetic theory because it has a kind of naive view of society that misses what he calls the agonistic aspect. When everything is kind of reduced to the transmission of information or to a kind of communication without persuasion, without seduction, that everything is reached through discussion rationally. Like all of this is this weird fantasy of an enlightenment that really has always been a kind of idealization.
We see that in Dune, the way that Herbert kind of undermines the whole kind of the, Enlightenment ideal of perfect knowledge of the future, perfect knowledge of the past, perfect being able to see the future, etcetera, right? Like, these are the things that these narratives we believed would lead to some type of utopian society, but again, what does it lead to? Authoritarian death and destruction, and
Oh, yeah.
I just had to
I
get my Dune in there real
No,
quick.
I totally agree. I totally agree.
This did actually make me think that Frank Herbert was way ahead of the game as far as deconstructing this, not only like the hero's journey itself, but the kind of basic premises of modernity and the Enlightenment with regard to, I don't even know if he necessarily set out to do that per se, but it's right, he didn't have to, right? Like desire sort of drove the bus there.
What is the last words of this book, since you said that?
This sketches the outline of a politics that will respect both the desire for the justice and the desire for the unknown.
Right, yeah. So he ends the book with these 2 desires, desire for justice and the desire for the unknown. That's a good point about the consequence of, dissensus, at least in the scientific discourse, which is the main focus point of this book, insofar as it's a report on knowledge, right? Is that science is not about necessarily making the unknown known, but the other way around, right? Opening up what sort of the fringes, the limits of knowledge itself, if you will,
Right, yeah,
and
yeah,
opening
that's
on to
good.
the unknown. I think this is why he turns to Gödel and showing how even in these simple quote unquote arithmetical systems, incompleteness is a fantasy.
Right, yeah, exactly.
That this can be one can infer from this implications for all modes of knowledge, all of the sciences, and that should not be seen as a defect, right? Of as though a divine understanding would, like Laplace's demon, right? Which he, I think,
Which I was gonna say
convincingly,
was like Muad'Dib almost. Is Muad'Dib
right?
like Laplace's demon?
Like this, like exactly, as though again, I think a divine understanding would be Kwisatz Haderach being able to sort of see past and future in all of its possible states and possible iterations and all
Right,
this.
yeah,
I
exactly,
d-
yeah, totally, duh.
I do think that that is a kind of fantasy that isn't about limits. It's almost, I mean, like, I don't know want to put this in a Kantian way, but it's like it's not necessarily limits of the understanding, but limits in the thing in itself, limits in the noumenon, not or of the noumenon, and not of. Now I'm starting to like question how Kant might frame it, and so I shouldn't even worry about it. But I guess that's the point, right? Is this census is to be cultivated insofar not just for its own sake, in the same way that consensus for its own sake in the ideal of communicative rationality is to be considered terror. So dissensus in its own sake would be, just mere anarchy or contrarianism,
Right,
right?
yeah, exactly.
I don't think that's what Lyotard means.
Yeah,
It's not about a contrarianism. It is about a vigilance of falling prey to a kind of conformity. It's a similar type of ethic in anti-Oedipus, right? Not to become enamored with power. I mean, there's this way in which there is a power in riding the waves of consensus in the scientific community, whether it be in funding from grants or commodifying one's research. One can multiply the examples and think about it. But if we even just like go to pure disinterested research, which is always never fully disinterested, but one can think of the ways in which prejudices of all stripes, be they philosophical or ethical or political, can contaminate and obstruct the creativity of science. I mean, I was thinking about this too. I mean, I used the Semmelweis example because it was so clear in my head. But one can also think about the way in which climate science is in a conundrum, not just, and this is not just a question of credulity or incredulity, but the question of ways in which reliably and justifiably climate science can be shown to have surplus value that can be extracted and capitalistic gains and et cetera, it can justify itself by means of commodification in order to present itself as a viable alternative. How it needs to like take on the guise of like green jobs or something like
Right,
this,
yeah.
which are obviously like valuable
Cap and
for
trade.
the discourse
Sure.
of the nation state, but not necessarily the discourse on the level at which the seriousness of of the calamity
Mhm.
impending demands, which is way beyond this question of how many green jobs can we get in your district to get your
Right.
vote, senator, or something like this. To be able to, maybe I'm not articulating this very
No,
well,
no,
but
I totally it's clear.
yeah,
I'm with
so
you.
the fact that it has to guise itself in the language of capitalistic extraction of surplus value is the only means by which it can take on viability. But at that level and at those stakes, it actually kind of does a disservice and perhaps perverts and prevents the
Yeah.
scale and the measures needed, which might and most likely most definitely would preclude the kind of extraction of surplus value that would deem it a viable
Oh,
project.
absolutely.
And
Right,
so
yeah.
this is
God.
the kind of dialectic
Uh,
that we've seen for a while now. I mean,
I
even
mean, our
back
whole fucking lives.
our whole fucking
Literally our whole
lives.
fucking lives.
I mean, at a certain
God,
point
that's grim.
in
Uh,
America, and we are Americans, so I'm using this example, but when you or I were young, global warming wasn't really a right wing, left wing thing. But now it's kind of more of a it's become tinged. I mean, we could say that Republicans are more opposed to climate change or science or the changes required thereof in the sphere of production, but it really is about the in what ways can, if we framed it in Lyotard's sense, it would be there is a equilibrium and a kind of sedimentation of whether it be coal jobs or fossil fuels. Those industries have a vested stake in what they will fund, including the politicians that can make these policies possible. That consensus is in standing in the way of the radical changes needed, right? So I guess that's, and what is insidious, and I guess we'll leave on this bleak note, is the
hell yeah.
way in which challenging climate science and its validity or denying it or saying God's in control of everything, whatever you want to do, can be appropriated by those as a form of dissensus against what you see this language about how there is this, whoa, the consensus of global scientists, isn't that just the state of opinion, isn't that just another conspiracy theory, blah
Right.
blah blah. You see that kind of language, and so there is an
The
insidiousness in appropriating what Lyotard is talking about and cultivating the census where it can be turned back.
yeah.
Well, is it your
Epistemological nihilism or nihilism, yeah.
something like that? Yeah, it is a kind of sophistry. And I think Lyotard, if he had to respond, would say, well, yes, but they are more like and this gets to the differ end, they are more like the fascists denying the Holocaust because they don't have
Yeah.
to play by the rules. They don't have to play by rules of a language game whereby they're going to verify or promote or prove or argue verifiable evidence. They're not going to play by the language game
They're
of
not
science.
doing Habermas's game, yeah.
They're well, or they're just not their language game isn't science at all, right? Because I don't think Leotard wants anyone to play Habermas's game.
Yeah, I guess, yeah,
You
you're
know,
right.
they're not, no, to a certain extent, they're playing Habermas's game because they want to say, no, let's keep having a discussion about this until we're all dead, right?
Yeah,
But
I guess that's true,
it's
yeah.
that they're not playing, they're not, there is a discrepancy between the language games and that science is playing and the type of sophistry and rhetoric that they are claiming in their claiming that the science is wrong. And there is no, I mean, this is also what Sartre says about the anti-Semite, right? Like he doesn't have to play fair. The anti-Semite doesn't have to follow rules of argumentation. They don't have to treat words seriously. You put them in a corner and they just say the time for argument is past. So there's no differing with anti-Semites, just as there's no possible differing between Holocaust deniers or no differing with climate change deniers, right? Their game is not to reach a state in which there could become a local little narrative, a provisional state of consensus, because I think that's involved too. It's just that consensus too core as a grand meta narrative is what has to be avoided. There is no, I think for them, they aren't obeying any rules of language games. They don't have to. They're not making moves in any kind of scientific language game at the very least. But there's no different to provide a means of accommodating these genres of discourse because there's no, as again, as Hart might say, there's nothing but bad faith on their side. And they use that as a weapon. And so if we get caught up in this notion of rational communication and discussion and think it is about convincing via traditional arguments, we're going to lose. It'd be like feeding trolls.
Right, exactly.
Um,
Which we see play out every day,
yeah,
1,000 times a fucking day.
that's what I would say at the end by way of example and by way of just kind of linking this to the differend because I do think it links up with the differend via this question of language games is it can very easily be weaponized. And I think that's where Leotard goes with it in order to tackle these famous cases. And I don't remember their names because I think they're beneath memory, but you know, these famous Holocaust deniers. And I think that there was a movie made of this. Maybe it was just called The Trial or shit. I gotta look that fucking thing up. It wasn't a great movie, but it did put forth the question at hand of Holocaust denier and suing. Was it a Stanford, Princeton professor for defamation for libel? He wanted to sue her in the UK because they have a little bit looser court system when it comes to libel and those kind of things, right? They're a little bit more slanted towards the accuser. In any case, it's David something, right? David again, I don't remember his name. Sorry, cut this out if you want, but fuck that guy. But anyway, Leotard is trying to think philosophically through this question of how could the differend provide the means for which a damage, an injury done cannot possibly be mediated by any means of discourse. In fact, the injury or harm done itself would not exist precisely because there would be no means in which it could evidence itself and testify to itself, right? So there is this sense in which this question of language games, they're non-hierarchy, they're non-unity, they're non-foundation, and any one of them is really drastically important politically, ethically, juridically. Otherwise, one could have, I think, no means for negotiating the types of injuries and harms that would be, you know, precluded based on those types of organization. If language games weren't heterogeneous, heteromorphic, if they were all, and this again comes back to terror for Leotard, if you have a kind of totalitarian closed notion of a system of language games that have a hierarchy and order, etc., and they are isomorphic, this is for him where terror takes form. This is the form of terror in language games. Obviously, the extreme limit he says is bureaucracy. You can think of the Brazil as a great way of like, and obviously Kafka-esque
The
shit
movie, not
where
this country, right?
right, the movie, yes, sorry, I mean, it's they've had Bolsonaro, so you could have thought the country, but yeah, no, I mean, the movie, I mean, like, there's a just a bug in the system causes a whole series of misunderstandings and inability there is an inability to play by any language game because of the absurdity of the accusations and there's a kind of different incredulity, if you will, towards the bureaucracy. But in any case, like doesn't take a bureaucracy to have a kind of regimentation of rules in language games, as Lyotard says. But we can imagine that as a the bureaucracy as a kind of Kafka-esque parody of the rules in language games. Everything in triplicate, TPS reports, shit like that. Any final thoughts, my brother?
Deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense, but the real universe is always one step beyond logic. It's my final thought. Thanks for tuning in. What about you? We feeling good about?
I think so. I know there was a couple more things we could have talked about, like how the inability of science to ground itself, to legitimate itself, means that the prescriptive, which wants to found itself on the denotative, the practical wants to ground itself on the scientific in order to ensure good moves in the injustice. But if science can't ground itself, the practical becomes ungrounded itself, blah, blah, blah. Right. So this is part of the crisis that it reverberates throughout the different language games. And I think, again, Lyotard thinks that that's actually a good thing because those foundations or those self foundations were fantasies at best, terroristic at worst. So they were nightmares or something, or hopelessly utopian. I didn't say a ton about the technological discourse of
Yeah.
efficiency and optimization, but I did at the same time when we started talking about surplus value and all of
Yeah.
this, where
Right.
it's
Yeah,
it's not a,
exactly. If it doesn't
yeah.
contribute to this sort of axiom, then it's discarded or not funded.
Mhm.
There's no positive feedback loop for it to attach itself to.
Exactly. So, and I think that Lyotard in his so this would have been 3 years earlier in the Decadence essay, will conflate the scientific discourse as not merely the language game of the denotative, but also the language game of efficiency. I think that he separates them here for matters of clarity. But if we think about it, science straddles both. It isn't just about the adequation of nature to knowledge and truth apart from practical effects. It's always concerned with its research is never pure, right? It's never pure knowledge. We have to be very clear that what he calls the technological regime of the discourse of efficiency and optimization and technocracy, et cetera, isn't necessarily separate from what science does. I think that 3 years earlier, and again, he wasn't writing to a state then for the Quebecois committee or whatever. Science for Lyotard was much more the language game of technology and optimization and efficiency, and in fact, terror. When he looked at the Beta group and how they were put in these isolation chambers, some to the point of death, but they became these guinea pigs, these like dream subjects for human science, because the human sciences have never had a subject, man himself, that could be completely isolated and turned into independent variables, except in these extreme terroristic circumstances. Ironically, the Beta group were a terrorist group, but they had terrorism done to them by science. And he says he has some line, some quip like all of this Hitlerian panoply done in a democratic regime by scientists who are isolating and kind of torturing these subjects in these sensory deprivation chambers, let's say. So they were completely independent of external stimuli, if you will. They were controlled variables. And that's this weird terroristic ideal of the human sciences, if you will. Not endemic to all of them, but foreign to the heart of them. So I would just say that's a discrepancy I see between the evil period and this period here, where he is distinguishing this discourse of knowledge and science and denotative, and then the technological discourse. Well, science obviously is involved in technology too. So that kind of distinction, I think, I'm not sure if he meant it to be so hard and fast, but I would say that science is never just playing the language game of knowledge and the denotative, right? It is also thinking of the optative. Unless we are thinking of knowledge purely as an encyclopedic sedimentation, which I don't think Lyotard agrees with, because new hypotheses, new theories always resurrect the question of legitimacy of science and its foundations. So, I mean, science can't be just on the side of the denotative. This again shows the interrelation of language games and how they can't fully be isolated or unified or centralized or homogenized or isomorphized, blah, blah, blah.
That'll wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Chair and Taylor Atkins. We'll see y'all next week.